The new CEO smiled as he erased my name from the project in front of the entire executive team. 5 minutes later, 3 federal agencies, our legal department, and the Launch Command Center were all asking the same question. Who approved the certifications? His smile disappeared the moment someone answered. She did. And without her signature, nothing leaves this building. People think humiliation is loud. It isn't. Real humiliation is perfectly organized. It wears expensive suits, carries polished presentation decks, and arrives 5 minutes early with coffee that still smells fresh. It settles into a leather chair under soft conference room lighting, while 30 pairs of eyes quietly avoid looking at you. By the time the new CEO walked into our quarterly executive review, every screen in the room displayed the company's biggest product launch of the decade. Engineers had spent 18 months building it. Marketing had already purchased millions of dollars in advertising. Investors were expecting the announcement before the end of the quarter. The legal department had prepared contracts. Sales teams were rehearsing presentations. Everyone looked excited. Everyone except me. Years of working in regulatory compliance had taught me that the most dangerous disasters rarely looked dangerous before they happened. They usually arrived wearing confidence instead of warning labels. I had spent 12 years becoming the company's senior compliance officer, collecting every federal certification required for products like ours, documenting every approval, every inspection, every audit trail, every signature that allowed our technology to exist outside laboratory walls. Most executives barely knew my department existed until something went wrong. That was exactly how I preferred it. Quiet systems keep companies alive. Loud executives simply take credit when those systems work. Unfortunately, our previous CEO retired, and his replacement believed silence meant insignificance. He introduced himself with the confidence of someone who had never been told he was wrong, smiled at every executive around the table, then stopped when he reached me. He glanced at my nameplate, frowned as though reading something unnecessary, and continued speaking without asking a single question about what I actually did. The meeting started with applause. It ended that applause almost immediately. The new CEO stood beside the giant display, holding a digital tablet like a judge preparing a verdict instead of a presentation. "We're building a faster company," he announced. "Less bureaucracy, fewer gatekeepers, no unnecessary layers slowing innovation." Heads nodded around the room. Executives love hearing that someone else is responsible for delays. He tapped the screen once, and an organizational chart appeared. Departments shifted across the display as if pieces on a chessboard were being rearranged by someone who had learned the rules yesterday. Then, my name disappeared. Not moved, not reassigned, erased. A tiny animation slid my responsibilities beneath the product strategy division, where people measured success in launch dates instead of regulatory obligations. The room became strangely quiet. My manager looked down at his notebook. Someone from finance cleared his throat but said nothing. Even the vice president of legal leaned back with an expression that suggested he had just realized he was watching a train approach a bridge that wasn't finished. The CEO noticed none of it. He laughed lightly and pointed toward the empty space where my name had been. "This," he said proudly, "is how companies stop hiding behind paperwork." A few nervous chuckles echoed across the room. They sounded less like agreement and more like survival. I simply closed my notebook. After 12 years, I had learned that people reveal themselves far more clearly when nobody interrupts them. He wasn't finished. "From today forward," he continued, pacing confidently across the room, "project approvals will flow directly through executive leadership. I don't want launches waiting because someone in compliance thinks another checklist matters." The word checklist hung in the air like an insult. Several engineers exchanged uneasy glances. They knew those checklists weren't decorations. Every document represented months of communication with federal regulators, testing laboratories, certification authorities, and independent inspectors whose approval determined whether our products could legally enter the market. Missing one signature could delay shipments for weeks. Missing the wrong one could trigger investigations lasting months. Yet none of those realities appeared on colorful executive dashboards. They existed quietly inside databases, archived correspondence, encrypted records, and legally required audit trails that almost nobody bothered to understand until regulators started asking questions. The CEO smiled toward me as though expecting an argument. Instead, I offered him a polite nod. Nothing frustrates arrogance more than the absence of resistance. Confidence built on assumptions usually collapses under silence long before facts arrive. The meeting moved on to launch timelines, investor expectations, and ambitious revenue forecasts. Every projection assumed the product would ship exactly 6 weeks later. Every slide celebrated speed. Nobody mentioned compliance again. Yet I noticed something far more interesting than the presentation itself. The head of legal had quietly stopped taking notes. Instead, she opened her laptop and began searching through internal policy documents. Across the table, our director of quality assurance slowly removed his glasses, rubbed the bridge of his nose, and stared at the organizational chart as though trying to solve an impossible equation. Even the chief technology officer, normally eager to support bold decisions, remained unusually silent. They weren't reacting to my embarrassment. They were calculating consequences. They knew something the CEO clearly didn't. My title had never been the source of my authority. My authority existed because federal certification records listed me by name as the designated compliance approver for every active product in the company's portfolio. Titles changed with executive announcements. Federal registrations did not. Somewhere deep inside government databases, inspection records, and certification files, my signature still represented the final legal checkpoint before release. Those records couldn't be erased with a presentation slide. When the meeting adjourned, executives hurried into the hallway pretending they had urgent calls to make. Nobody approached me immediately. That silence spoke louder than sympathy ever could. As I gathered my notebook, the CEO walked past with the effortless confidence of a man convinced he had just modernized an entire corporation before lunch. "Nothing personal," he said casually. "We're just eliminating unnecessary obstacles." I smiled, not because I agreed, but because I suddenly understood something he didn't. Obstacles only exist when you know where they're hidden. He had just removed the only person who knew every invisible bridge holding his billion-dollar launch above the ground. If you think the worst part of today's meeting was having my name erased from the project, you haven't seen what happens when invisible responsibilities refuse to disappear. The hallway outside the executive conference room felt strangely colder than it had an hour earlier. Conversations that usually bounced between glass walls had dissolved into whispers, as though the building itself had decided to lower its voice. Employees who normally smiled as they passed me suddenly found urgent reasons to check their phones or stare into laptops they weren't actually reading. Corporate buildings have their own weather. Confidence is sunshine, rumors are fog. Fear is the pressure drop that tells everyone a storm is coming long before the first thunder arrives. I walked toward my office at the end of the compliance wing, carrying nothing but my notebook, while behind me I could hear the new CEO laughing with members of the executive team about cutting red tape. Every laugh echoed a little too loudly across the marble floor. It reminded me of someone celebrating after tearing out the foundation of a house because the basement looked unnecessary. They weren't laughing because they understood the structure. They were laughing because it hadn't collapsed yet. I had barely reached my desk before my inbox began filling faster than I could read. First came an automated notification from the product launch office announcing that all approval workflows had been reassigned under direct executive management. 2 minutes later, another message arrived from Information Technology, informing me that my editing permissions for the launch dashboard had been revoked to reflect organizational restructuring. Someone had worked remarkably fast. It almost impressed me. Then came a third email from Human Resources, politely confirming my new reporting structure. It was written in the warm, carefully polished language corporations use when delivering bad news with pleasant grammar. Every sentence spoke about efficiency, streamlined collaboration, and leadership alignment. Not one sentence mentioned responsibility. Responsibility, unlike authority, rarely appears in executive announcements. It appears later, inside legal documents. I leaned back in my chair and watched sunlight crawl across rows of framed certificates hanging on the opposite wall. Visitors often assumed those frames were decorations celebrating years of service. They weren't. Every certificate represented months of negotiations with federal regulators, testing laboratories, independent inspectors, manufacturing audits, environmental reviews, cybersecurity assessments, and compliance interviews. Each approval had required thousands of pages of documentation and dozens of signatures before a single government official finally signed the last page. Yet hidden in nearly every one of those approval packages was the same requirement, repeated in slightly different legal language. The designated compliance officer responsible for certification continuity must approve any material product release. That designated officer wasn't my department. It wasn't my manager. It wasn't the CEO. It was me, by name. Federal agencies don't update those records because a company announces a new organizational chart during an executive meeting. Those records move at the speed of law, not ego. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. I looked up to find Amanda, senior counsel from the legal department, standing quietly in my doorway. She didn't smile. Lawyers rarely waste facial expressions when uncertainty enters the room. She stepped inside, closed the door behind her, and lowered her voice. "Tell me he didn't ask you about the certification registry." I shook my head once. Her shoulders dropped ever so slightly, not from relief, but from confirmation. "I thought so," she whispered. "He's assuming internal authority automatically transfers external authorization." She walked toward the framed certificates, studying them like someone counting emergency exits inside a burning theater. "Please tell me the registry updated automatically." I didn't answer immediately because silence sometimes communicates facts more effectively than explanations. Amanda closed her eyes for a brief second before exhaling. "It doesn't," she finally muttered to herself. "Of course it doesn't." She already knew the answer before asking. She simply needed to hear someone else say nothing. The rest of the afternoon unfolded with almost theatrical confidence upstairs. Marketing released internal countdown graphics celebrating the upcoming launch. Product strategy booked interviews with industry publications. Finance circulated revised revenue projections, assuming record-breaking first-quarter sales. Every department accelerated, as though speed alone could outrun paperwork. Meanwhile, the compliance floor remained almost unnaturally quiet. My team continued processing inspection records, supplier validations, manufacturing reports, and laboratory updates exactly as they had every day before the reorganization. Regulations never panic. Deadlines never celebrate. They simply wait. Around 3 o'clock, one of my analysts quietly placed a thick binder on my desk without saying a word. On its cover was the final federal certification package for the launch product. Every technical review had been completed, every testing laboratory had signed off, every environmental requirement had passed, every cybersecurity assessment was approved. Only one section remained empty, the signature page. I opened the binder slowly, almost respectfully. There it was, waiting with quiet patience beneath dozens of completed forms. A single blank line above printed text identifying the designated federal compliance approver. Underneath the line was my full legal name. Not my title, not my department, my name. Ink didn't care who occupied the corner office. Ink cared who the government recognized. I closed the binder again and placed it carefully beside my keyboard. I wasn't refusing to sign. There was simply no request to review the final package. The workflow had been removed from my dashboard that morning. Ironically, the only person authorized to complete the process no longer had access to the process itself. Less than an hour later, the first crack finally appeared. An invitation marked "Urgent" flashed across my calendar. Executive review. Attendance required. Conference room A. No agenda, no explanation, just 15 minutes from now. As I entered the boardroom, the atmosphere felt completely different from the confident celebration that had filled it earlier that morning. The giant display no longer showed marketing graphics or optimistic revenue charts. Instead, a single sentence glowed across the screen in plain black letters against a white background. Product release status. Regulatory approval pending. Nobody spoke. The new CEO stood at the front of the room with crossed arms, staring at the screen as though it had personally betrayed him. Beside him stood Amanda from legal, the head of quality assurance, the CTO, and two directors I recognized from internal audit. A printed folder rested on the table in front of each executive. Mine remained unopened. For the first time since he'd arrived, the CEO wasn't smiling. He looked directly at me. "So," he said carefully, "can someone explain why the system says our launch can't move forward?" Every eye in the room shifted in my direction. Some questions change careers. The next answer was about to change much more than that. Have you ever worked with a boss who made a decision before understanding how things actually worked? Share your story below and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter. The executive boardroom had transformed in less than 15 minutes. Earlier that morning, everyone had applauded as the new CEO proudly erased my name from the company's most important project, promising a faster organization with fewer bureaucratic obstacles. Now the only thing displayed on the giant screen was a single sentence that had silenced every executive in the room. Product release status. Regulatory approval pending. The CEO immediately ordered the IT director to restore every permission removed from my account. Within minutes, my access was reinstated, but when the launch coordinator attempted to submit the final certification package, the system rejected it again. "Try another account," the CEO snapped. They did. The result didn't change. Every approval was complete except the final one, and the system refused to move forward. Frustration quickly replaced confidence. "Who exactly has the authority to approve this?" he demanded. Amanda from legal quietly placed a federal certification binder in front of him. "The person listed here," she replied. He opened the highlighted page and froze. My full legal name appeared beneath "Designated Federal Compliance Approver." He looked up at me, then back at the document, convinced he had misunderstood something. "Just update the record," he said. Amanda calmly shook her head. "This isn't an internal database, it's a federal certification. Changing the designated approver requires a formal amendment, agency review, and approval." "How long?" he asked. "Usually 60 to 90 business days." No one spoke after that. The product launch was scheduled for less than 2 weeks away. The silence broke when the chief financial officer opened his laptop and calculated the consequences. Delaying the launch would freeze shipments already sitting in warehouses, postpone millions of dollars in signed distributor contracts, waste a national advertising campaign, and force retailers to cancel launch events. Within a few minutes, he looked around the table and quietly said, "Our immediate exposure exceeds $40 million. The number hung over the room like a storm cloud. Earlier that day, The CEO had dismissed compliance as paperwork. Now everyone understood that the paperwork was the only thing protecting the company from financial disaster. He turned back toward me with a calmer voice. "Fine. Review the package today and sign it." It sounded reasonable until Amanda interrupted again. "She can't." The CEO stared at her. "Why not?" Amanda opened another file, this one containing the company's electronic audit trail. Every permission removed from my account that morning had already been permanently recorded with timestamps, executive authorization, and digital signatures. The system had synchronized those changes with the protected compliance database used during inspections. Restoring my approval authority without completing the required regulatory process would create conflicting authorization records and automatically trigger an audit exception. The CEO slowly realized his own decision had become part of a permanent compliance record. It wasn't something IT could delete or rewrite. Every action taken that morning was already preserved. Before anyone could suggest another solution, the conference room door opened, and the corporate secretary stepped inside carrying a sealed envelope marked Internal Audit, Priority Review. She handed it directly to the general counsel, who read the first page before looking at the CEO with an expression that said everything. "Internal Audit has automatically opened a governance review," she announced. The system detected that a federally designated compliance approver was removed from an active certification project without a documented regulatory impact assessment. Around the table, nobody argued. Nobody blamed anyone else. Even the executives who had applauded the restructuring earlier that morning remained completely silent. The CEO lowered himself into his chair for the first time since the meeting began. His attempt to demonstrate authority had done exactly the opposite. Instead of speeding up the launch, he had delayed it, triggered an internal investigation, and placed the company's biggest project under board-level review, all before lunchtime. He finally looked at me again, but this time there was no confidence left in his expression. Only one uncomfortable realization. Removing my name from the organizational chart had never removed my responsibility from the federal record. If you think the investigation was the CEO's biggest problem, wait until the board discovers why the previous CEO insisted that my name, and only my name, remain on every federal certification dot. The board's Risk and Compliance Committee assembled the following morning, nearly a week earlier than its regular schedule. That alone told everyone how serious the situation had become. Directors rarely involved themselves in operational decisions, but the words federal certification, governance review, and product launch delay had a way of moving meetings to the top of every calendar. By the time I entered the boardroom, the atmosphere felt completely different from the executive meeting the day before. Nobody was interested in ambitious forecasts or motivational speeches. Every chair was occupied by people carrying printed reports instead of presentation tablets. The company's outside legal counsel had joined by video conference. Internal Audit sat beside the general counsel, and the new CEO looked noticeably less confident than he had 24 hours earlier. The chairman opened the meeting without ceremony. "We're not here to discuss personalities," he said. "We're here to understand how a leadership decision created a regulatory crisis in less than one business day." Every eye turned toward the CEO. He defended himself by repeating the same argument he had used from the beginning. He believed the compliance function had become unnecessarily bureaucratic and wanted executive leadership to control approvals directly. He insisted he had never intended to violate regulations and argued that no reasonable system should depend on a single employee. The directors listened without interrupting. When he finished, the chairman thanked him, then turned to Internal Audit. Their lead investigator projected a detailed timeline onto the screen. It showed the exact minute my approval roll had been removed, The automatic permission changes, the failed certification submission, the audit exception generated by the compliance platform, and finally, the governance alert that had reached the board before the end of the day. Every event was supported by timestamps and digital records. There were no opinions, only facts. Did anyone request a regulatory impact assessment before removing the designated approver? The chairman asked. No, the investigator replied. Did legal approve the restructuring? No. Did compliance review the change? No. The room fell silent. The problem was no longer the failed product launch. It was the complete absence of the controls the company had spent years building. Then the chairman looked at me. I'd like you to explain why your name appears on every active federal certification. I opened the binder that had followed me through every meeting and placed a single letter on the table. It was signed by the previous CEO 3 years earlier. After a difficult federal inspection, regulators had required the company to appoint one accountable compliance officer with independent authority over final certifications. The letter explained that separating compliance from executive pressure was a condition for maintaining the company's regulatory standing. Your authority wasn't created for convenience, the chairman said after reading it. It was created because the regulators demanded independence. The outside legal counsel agreed immediately. If executives can replace the final approver whenever approval becomes inconvenient, the certification process loses credibility. That's exactly what regulators wanted to prevent. Several directors slowly nodded. For the first time, the board understood that my authority had never belonged to management. It existed because the government required someone who could make compliance decisions without fearing executive pressure. The chairman closed the file and turned back to the CEO. You didn't just remove an employee from a project. You attempted to restructure a federally recognized control without consulting legal, compliance, or the board. The CEO started to respond, but stopped halfway through his sentence. There was nothing left to argue. Every document contradicted him. Every timestamp confirmed the sequence of events. The directors exchanged quiet glances before the chairman announced the committee's first decision. Effective immediately, all organizational changes affecting compliance authority would be suspended until the investigation concluded. The second decision followed only seconds later. The product launch would remain on hold until the original certification process was fully restored and independently verified. It wasn't punishment, it was damage control. As the meeting came to an end, I gathered my papers, expecting the discussion to be over. Instead, the chairman asked me to remain behind. Once the room had emptied, he placed a thin, confidential folder on the table. There's one document we recovered from the former CEO's archive last night, he said quietly. After reading it, you'll understand why he insisted your name stay on every certification, even after he retired. He slid the folder toward me but didn't open it. For the first time since this began, I realized the story hadn't started with the new CEO's decision. It had started years earlier. I waited until the last director had left before opening the confidential folder. Inside wasn't a secret government report or a legal complaint. It was a handwritten memo from the former CEO, dated 3 years earlier, immediately after the company had passed the most difficult federal inspection in its history. Attached to it was the regulator's final recommendation. The language was direct. Because the company had expanded into highly regulated markets, the final certification authority had to remain independent from executive influence. Any attempt to place that authority under operational leadership would create an unacceptable conflict of interest. The former CEO had accepted the recommendation without hesitation. In his memo to the board, he explained why he had selected me. It wasn't because I had been the loudest person in the company or the most senior executive. It was because, during 12 years in compliance, I had delayed launches when documentation was incomplete, challenged managers when testing wasn't finished, and once rejected a multi-million-dollar release because a supplier had failed a required audit. Every decision had cost the company time in the short term, but every decision had protected it from far greater losses. His final sentence stayed with me longer than anything else on the page. A company can replace a CEO in a day. It cannot replace credibility once regulators lose it. The board reconvened later that afternoon with a single objective: restore the certification process correctly. This time, there were no speeches about speed or efficiency. Legal reversed the unauthorized restructuring, internal audit documented every corrective action, and the IT department rebuilt the approval workflow under the supervision of compliance. Every step was recorded, reviewed, and signed. Only after the entire audit trail matched federal requirements did Amanda place the certification binder in front of me. "Everything has been independently verified," she said. I spent the next 2 hours reviewing every test report, manufacturing record, supplier validation, and inspection summary one final time. No shortcuts were taken simply because executives were waiting. When I reached the final page, I signed it exactly as I had signed dozens before it, with the same careful attention and without a single dramatic word. Minutes later, the federal submission portal accepted the package. A green confirmation appeared on the screen, followed by the message everyone had been waiting to see. Certification approved. Product release authorized. No one applauded. After everything that had happened, silence felt more appropriate than celebration. The board concluded its investigation the following week. Their report made one point unmistakably clear: the failure had not been caused by the compliance system, but by the decision to bypass it. New governance policies required executive approval for future organizational changes involving regulated functions, while compliance was given direct reporting access to the board's Risk and Compliance Committee. The new CEO remained in his position, but his authority over certification decisions was permanently limited. It wasn't presented as punishment, it was presented as a safeguard, ensuring that no future leader, no matter how confident or experienced, could place the company's regulatory standing at risk through a single impulsive decision. The lesson became part of leadership training for every executive who joined the company after that. Several weeks later, the CEO stopped by my office. There were no cameras, no audience, and no attempt to rewrite what had happened. He admitted that he had confused authority with expertise and assumed every problem inside the company could be solved through restructuring. "I thought compliance slowed the business," he said quietly. "I never realized it was protecting it." I thanked him for saying it, and we returned to work. There was nothing else to prove. My name was never restored to the organizational chart in a larger font. No public ceremony was held, and I never asked for recognition. I didn't need it. The regulations hadn't changed. The certification hadn't changed. What had changed was the company's understanding of why those systems existed in the first place. People often ask who won that battle. They expect a story about revenge or humiliation. The truth is much simpler. No one wins when a company forgets how accountability works. The real victory came when the organization remembered that trust is built quietly, one signature, one audit, and one honest decision at a time. Titles can disappear with a presentation slide. Credibility cannot.